I mistook the blinding flashes for a celebration of my promotion. Instead, 50 phones live-streamed my parents, handing me a bill for $800,000 alongside DNA results, proving I was no daughter of theirs. While my sister laughed, a man stood up in the back. My parents thought they had invited the world to witness my humiliation, but they had actually invited the one person holding the power to send them all to prison. My name is Grace Lockridge, and as I stood before the towering mahogany doors of the Emerald Room, I felt the heavy, textured weight of the invite card in my clutch, like a promise finally kept. The air in the corridor of the Chicago Grand Hotel smelled of beeswax polish and expensive lilies, the kind of scent that usually preceded weddings or high-stakes mergers. I smoothed the silk of my dress, a custom piece I had commissioned specifically for this night. It was a deep midnight blue, tailored to perfection, hugging my frame in a way that made me feel powerful, architectural, and undeniably present. For 30 years, I had been the invisible daughter, the background noise to my sister's vibrant chaos. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was the night Richard and Sylvia Harland, the people I had spent 3 decades trying to please, were finally throwing a party for me. I checked my reflection in the brass handle of the door. My hair was swept back, my makeup flawless. I looked like the youngest partner at Vanguard Horizons, not the girl who used to wear hand-me-down sneakers until the soles flapped open. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, conditioned air, and pushed the doors open. I expected jazz. I expected the clinking of crystal flutes, the low hum of chatter, perhaps a sudden eruption of applause. I expected the warmth of a celebration. What I walked into was a vacuum. The Emerald Room was cavernous, living up to its name with green velvet drapes that swallowed the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. But it was the layout that made my steps falter. There were no round banquet tables scattered for conversation. There was no buffet line laden with hors d'oeuvres. There was no bar. Instead, 80 gold-backed chairs were arranged in rigid military straight rows, all facing a raised platform at the far end of the room. It looked less like a 30th birthday party and more like a tribunal, and every single chair was occupied. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy physical thing that pressed against my eardrums. 80 heads turned simultaneously as I stepped onto the plush carpet. The sound of my heels, usually a confident click, was muffled, making me feel untethered. I scanned the faces, my smile faltering, twitching at the corners as I tried to hold it in place. I saw Aunt Linda, who was sitting in the second row with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her lips pursed into a thin, white line. Next to her was Uncle Bob, who refused to meet my eyes, staring intently at the pattern on the carpet. Behind them sat the neighbors from our old cul-de-sac, people who had watched me grow up, people who had seen me ride my bike and mow the lawn. They looked at me not with warmth, but with a bizarre mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, like onlookers at a car wreck waiting to see if the driver would crawl out alive. My stomach gave a violent lurch when I looked toward the back rows. My breath hitched. Sitting there, in their work suits, were my colleagues from Vanguard Horizons. There was Sarah, the junior architect I was mentoring. There was David, the project manager for the library bid. Even the head of HR was there. Why were they here? I had not given my parents the guest list for my work friends. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This was a collision of worlds that should never have happened. My professional life was my sanctuary, the one place where I was defined by my blueprints and my calculations, not by my role as the Harland family's disappointment. Seeing them here felt like a violation. I forced my legs to move. I had to get to the front. I had to understand. At the end of the aisle, standing on the raised stage usually reserved for wedding bands, were my parents. Richard and Sylvia stood like statues. My father wore his Sunday suit, the gray one that had grown a little tight around the midsection. But his posture was stiff, military. My mother wore a high-necked dress that offered no softness. There was no happy birthday banner. There were no balloons. Behind them, a massive projector screen descended from the ceiling, blank and white, glowing with a low-level hum that grated on my nerves. And then there was Tiffany. My sister was not on the stage. She was prowling the space between the front row and the platform. At 26, Tiffany was a creature of the internet, a woman who lived her life in 15-second increments. She was dressed in something sparkling and loud, a dress that cost more than my first car. In her hand, she held a gimbal, the stabilizer keeping her smartphone perfectly level as she panned it across the room. I could see the ring light attached to the phone case reflecting in her eyes. She was live streaming as I walked down the center aisle, the only moving object in a room of statues. Tiffany turned the camera toward me. A bright, predatory smile stretched across her face. It was not a smile of greeting. It was the smile of a hunter who had just flushed the quarry out of the brush. She didn't say a word to me. She just tracked my movement with the lens, ensuring that her thousands of followers caught every frame of my confusion. "Mom? Dad?" My voice sounded thin, swallowed by the acoustics of the room. "What is this? Why is everyone sitting like that?" I reached the base of the platform. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe this was a roast? A weird, avant-garde performance piece? Richard had a strange sense of humor sometimes. Yes, that had to be it. They were playing a joke before bringing out the cake. I stepped up onto the stage, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my desperate need for their affection pushing me forward. I reached out for my mother. I wanted to hug her. I wanted to feel her arms around me and hear her whisper that they were proud of me, that the last 4 weeks of dinners and kindness hadn't been a mirage. "I'm so glad you," I began, reaching for her hand. Sylvia moved with a speed I didn't know she possessed. She slapped my hand away. It wasn't a playful swat. It was a hard, sharp rejection that echoed through the silent room. The sound of skin hitting skin was shocking. I froze. My hand hovered in the air, stinging. I looked at her face, searching for a sign of regret, but found only a mask of cold, hard granite. Her eyes, usually so readable, were blank walls. Then, the feedback squeal of a microphone tore through the air, sharp and agonizing. My father, Richard, had stepped up to the podium. He tapped the microphone twice, thump, thump, a sound that boomed through the speakers like a gavel. "Sit down, Grace," he said. His voice was not the warm baritone he used when he wanted something. It was flat, stripped of all paternal cadence. "Dad, what is going on?" I pleaded, my voice trembling. "You're scaring me. Why is Vanguard here? Why is Tiffany filming?" "I said sit down," Richard commanded, pointing to a lone wooden stool placed center stage. Facing the audience, it was the seat of the accused. I looked at the crowd again. 80 faces. No one moved to help me. Sarah, my mentee, looked down at her lap, her face red. My aunt stared straight through me. The isolation was absolute. It felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving only nitrogen and judgment. I sank onto the stool because my knees gave out, not because I wanted to obey. Richard gripped the sides of the podium. He looked out at the audience, then at the camera lens that Tiffany was wielding with gleeful precision. "Welcome, everyone," Richard announced, his voice booming. "Thank you for coming on such short notice, and to those watching on the stream, welcome." He paused for dramatic effect. He had always loved an audience. "We gathered you here under the pretense of a birthday celebration," he continued, and a ripple of murmurs went through the crowd. "Grace thinks she is here to be honored. She thinks she is here to be celebrated as a daughter, a success story, a member of this family." He turned to look down at me. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated loathing. It was a look that erased 30 years of memories. "But today is not a celebration," Richard declared, his voice rising. "Today is a reckoning. Today is not a party. It is an invoice. It is a bill-collecting ceremony. Today is the day we settle a mistake that has been dragging on for 30 long, expensive years." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. A mistake. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands gripped the edges of the stool so hard my knuckles turned white. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what he meant, but no sound came out. The cruelty was so sudden, so immense, that it short-circuited my brain. Tiffany giggled. It was a wet, sharp sound. She moved closer, thrusting the phone within inches of my face. I could see the stream of comments flying up the side of her screen. Emojis of popcorn, laughing faces, and skulls. "Look at her face, guys," Tiffany whispered to her audience, though in the silence, it carried to the back of the room. "She literally has no idea. This is going to be gold. Keep tapping the screen for likes." I felt like an animal trapped in a spotlight. I looked left, then right. The walls of the emerald room seemed to be closing in, the green velvet turning into the bars of a cage. I wanted to scream, to flip the stool, to storm out, but I was paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of it. And then, amidst the sea of hostile and indifferent faces, my eyes landed on the back corner of the room. It was the darkest part of the hall, where the light from the chandeliers didn't quite reach. There was a man sitting there. He was alone, separated from the rows of family and colleagues by a few feet of empty space. He was dressed in a black suit that looked sharper, more expensive than anything else in the room, cut from a fabric that seemed to absorb the shadows around him. He was wearing sunglasses, dark, opaque aviators, indoors, at night. He wasn't looking at the stage. He wasn't looking at Richard. Even from this distance, I could feel that behind those dark lenses, he was looking directly at me. He sat with a stillness that was terrifyingly controlled, unlike the fidgeting, uncomfortable guests around him. As Richard took a breath to continue his tirade, the man in the back moved his hand. He was slowly, rhythmically, twisting a silver ring on the pinky finger of his left hand. Twist, twist, twist. It was a small motion, but it was the only thing in the room that felt grounded. Who was he? I didn't know him. I had never seen him before in my life. Yet, as my father prepared to deliver the next blow, the stranger in the sunglasses leaned forward slightly, his chin lifting just an inch, as if he were waiting for a specific signal. I didn't know it then, sitting on that stool of shame while my sister broadcasted my humiliation to the world. But that man in the shadows was the only reason I wouldn't leave this room in a body bag of despair. But at that moment, all I knew was that the man who had raised me was pointing a finger at my chest, and the execution was about to begin. To understand how I ended up paralyzed on that wooden stool, a public spectacle for my sister's internet fame. You have to rewind the clock. You have to go back 4 weeks to the moment the trap was actually set. It did not happen in the Emerald Room. It happened over a pot roast that was too dry and a bottle of wine that was too cheap, in the dining room of the house where I grew up but never felt at home. 4 weeks ago, I was sitting in my corner office at Vanguard Horizons. It was 9 at night. The city of Chicago was a grid of amber lights sprawling out beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows, but my entire world was focused on the drafting table in front of me. I was the lead architect on the new municipal library project, a design that was going to redefine the skyline. My eyes were burning from staring at CAD renderings, and my fingers were stained with graphite from my sketches. I was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. It was the fatigue of building something permanent. Then my phone buzzed against the glass surface of my desk. When I saw the caller ID, my stomach tightened. It said Mother. Sylvia Harland did not call me. In the last decade, our communication had been strictly transactional. I sent money. She cashed it. I sent birthday cards. She ignored them. If the phone was ringing, it usually meant someone was in the hospital or they needed a co-signer for a loan. I braced myself for a crisis and swiped answer. Grace, darling. Her voice purred through the speaker. I nearly dropped the phone. The tone was unrecognizable. It was not the shrill, demanding voice I was used to. It was warm. It was sweet. It sounded like the mothers I saw in movies, the ones who baked cookies and asked about your day. Mom? I asked, skepticism warring with a sudden, pathetic leap of hope in my chest. Is everything okay? Is Dad all right? Oh, Richard is fine, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. We were just talking about you. It has been so long since we had a proper family dinner. We miss you. Grace, we were hoping you could come over this Sunday. Just the four of us. I sat in silence for a long moment, the hum of the office ventilation system filling the void. Just the four of us. The phrase felt alien. There was never a four of us. There was always the three of them. Richard, Sylvia, and Tiffany. And then there was me, orbiting their tight constellation like a piece of space debris. Sunday? I repeated, stalling. I have a lot of work on the library proposal. Please, Grace, she said, and her voice dropped to a register that sounded dangerously like begging. It is almost your 30th birthday. That is a big milestone. Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking. We want to see you. I should have said no. I should have remembered the 10 years of silence. I should have remembered the way they looked at me like a stain on their carpet. But the little girl inside me, the one who just wanted her mother to brush her hair, took over the controls. Okay, I said softly. I will be there. That Sunday, as I drove my modest sedan toward the suburbs, the memories I had suppressed for years began to bleed into the present. I passed the strip mall where Tiffany used to get her nails done every week while I waited in the car doing homework. I passed the high school where the ghost of my 16-year-old self still haunted the hallways. The memory of the state math championship hit me so hard I had to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was 16. I had spent months studying, staying up until 3 a.m. practicing calculus problems until numbers danced behind my eyelids. I had advanced to the state finals. It was the biggest achievement of my life up to that point. I had begged my parents to come. I had put the flyer on the refrigerator. I had reminded them every morning for 2 weeks. When I walked onto the stage to accept the first-place trophy, the applause was thunderous. I looked out into the auditorium, scanning the faces in the front rows, searching for Richard and Sylvia. I wanted to see my father pumping his fist. I wanted to see my mother crying tears of joy. But the seats I had reserved for them were empty. I stood there, holding a golden cup that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Smiling a frozen, broken smile for the local newspaper photographer, I took a cab home that night because they had forgotten to pick me up. When I walked through the front door, bursting with the news of my victory, hoping that maybe they had just gotten a flat tire, I found them in the living room. Tiffany was crying on the sofa, eating a tub of ice cream. Richard and Sylvia were comforting her. What happened? I had asked, still holding my trophy. Hush, Grace, Sylvia had snapped, not even looking at me. Tiffany didn't get the call back for the teen modeling agency. She is devastated. Read the room. But I won, I whispered. I won the state championship. Math isn't going to get you on the cover of Vogue, is it? Richard had muttered. Go to your room, and don't make noise. Your sister needs rest. I went to my room and put the trophy in the back of my closet, under a pile of old blankets. I never looked at it again. Driving to their house 4 weeks ago, I told myself things had changed. I am an adult now. I was successful. Surely, that commanded respect. Surely, they could not ignore me now that I was designing the city they lived in. When I arrived, the house looked the same, but the atmosphere was disorienting. Richard opened the door with a smile that showed teeth. Sylvia kissed my cheek. Tiffany was actually sitting at the dining table instead of lying in bed. Though she was tapping furiously on her phone, the table was set with the good china, the plates I was never allowed to touch growing up. There was a pot roast in the center, and Richard poured me a glass of wine that cost more than $5. So, Richard said, cutting into the meat. We hear things, rumors. I paused, my fork halfway to my mouth. What rumors? About the firm, he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity I mistook for paternal interest. Word on the street is that Vanguard Horizons is looking for a new creative director, and your name is at the top of the list. I felt a flush of pride warm my cheeks. It is not official yet, Dad, but yes, The partners are voting next month. If I get the library project approved, the position is mine." "That is incredible," Sylvia said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her skin felt dry and cool. "Our daughter, a director. We always knew you were special. Grace, we might have been hard on you, but it was only to push you, to make you strong." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. I drank the wine, letting it wash away the skepticism. "Thank you, Mom. That is why we want to do something big for you," Richard announced, leaning back in his chair. "Your 30th birthday is coming up. We want to throw you a party, a real party, at the Chicago Grand Hotel." I choked on my water. "The Chicago Grand? Dad, that is incredibly expensive. You don't have to do that." "We want to," he insisted. "We want to make up for missed opportunities. We want to show the world how proud we are of you. Invite your friends. Invite your colleagues from Vanguard. Let us show you off." Tears pricked my eyes. This was it. This was the moment I had waited 30 years for. The validation, the acceptance, the apology, unspoken but implied in the grand gesture. "I can help pay for it," I offered immediately. "If we are doing the Emerald Room, that is going to be thousands of dollars. Let me contribute." "Absolutely not," Sylvia said sharply, then softened her tone. "No, Grace, this is our gift. We can handle it. We have been saving." I looked at Tiffany. She wasn't looking at me. She was smirking at her phone screen. But I ignored it. I was too high on the validation. "You know," I said, my voice trembling with vulnerability, "I have been saving too. I have been eating ramen and living in that tiny studio for 7 years for a reason." Richard stopped chewing. He looked at me with a sudden, predatory stillness. "Oh? What reason is that?" I put down my fork. I felt safe. I felt like I was finally inside the circle of trust. To become a partner at Vanguard, you have to buy in. It is a massive capital contribution, but it secures your equity in the firm forever. I have finally hit the number. "And what is the number?" Sylvia asked softly. $1 million, I whispered. "I have $1 million sitting in a high-yield account, ready to transfer the day they offer me the partnership." The silence that followed was heavy. I saw Richard look at Sylvia. I saw Sylvia look at Tiffany. I saw a look pass between the three of them that was electric. At the time, I thought it was awe. I thought they were stunned by my success. I thought they were impressed that the girl they had neglected had become a self-made millionaire. Richard's eyes were wide. The pupils dilated. $1 million, he repeated, tasting the words. "That is a lot of money. Grace, liquid?" "Liquid," I confirmed proudly. "You have done well," he said. And for the first time in my life, he sounded sincere. But I missed the undercurrent. I missed the way his hand tightened around the stem of his wine glass. I missed the way Sylvia's tongue darted out to wet her lips, like a lizard spotting a fly. "We definitely need to have this party then," Tiffany said. Finally speaking up, she looked at me, and her eyes were cold. Dead things. "We need to celebrate everything you are worth." I left that dinner floating on air. I drove home thinking that my life had finally come together. I had the career, I had the money, and now, finally, I had my family. I was such a fool. I look back on that night now, and I see the scene with perfect clarity. It wasn't a family reunion, it was a deposition. They weren't feeding me because they loved me. They were feeding me to see if I was fat enough for the slaughter. They needed to know if I had enough assets to make their long con worth the effort. They needed to know if the juice was worth the squeeze. When I told them about the $1 million, I didn't see pride. I saw calculation. I saw them mentally spending my life's work. I saw them realizing that the nest egg they had been waiting for was finally ready to be cracked open. That dinner was not an olive branch. It was the moment the wolves decided to stop circling and go for the throat. And I, desperate for a scrap of love, had bared my neck and handed them the knife. If you want to understand the physics of my family, you have to understand the law of opposites. For every drop of sweat I poured into the foundation of my life, My sister Tiffany siphoned a gallon of gasoline to fuel the bonfire of her vanity. We were not just sisters. We were different species inhabiting the same ecosystem. One building the nest, and the other setting it on fire for the views. My life was a masterpiece of discipline. For the last 7 years, my alarm clock had gone off at 5 in the morning, piercing the dark silence of my rented apartment. I lived in a studio in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, but not the trendy part. I lived in a walk-up with radiator pipes that clanged like a prison riot and a view of a brick wall. My furniture was from IKEA, assembled with my own hands, and my wardrobe consisted of 5 high-quality suits that I rotated with military precision to give the illusion of variety. I worked 14 hours a day. That is not an exaggeration. I arrived at Vanguard Horizons before the janitorial staff had finished polishing the lobby floors, and I often left when the city lights were the only things illuminating the streets. I ate lunch at my desk, usually a sandwich I had made at home, while reviewing zoning laws and structural load calculations. I did this to save money, yes, but also because I love the honesty of architecture. In my world, if the math was wrong, the building fell down. There was no room for lies in physics, and despite this frugality, despite counting every penny to reach my goal of buying into the firm, I had a recurring monthly expense that I never listed on my tax returns. On the first of every month, I transferred $2,000 to my parents' joint account. They never asked for it explicitly. They never said the words, "Grace, we need money." Instead, it was a dance of guilt. My mother would mention the rising cost of heating oil, or my father would sigh about the property taxes. So, I paid. I paid $2,000 a month for the privilege of being their daughter, a subscription fee for a service I never actually received. Then there was Tiffany. At 26 years old, my sister's resume was a blank sheet of paper, but her Instagram feed was a curated gallery of a life she did not own. Tiffany described herself as a lifestyle curator and a digital muse. In reality, she was a professional parasite. While I was reviewing blueprints at dawn, Tiffany was sleeping off a hangover until noon. Her work consisted of setting up a ring light in the living room of our parents' house, which she claimed was her minimalist loft, and unboxing luxury products she had bought, filmed, and would return the next day for a full refund. She lived in a fantasy world where credit limits were just suggestions and consequences were things that happened to other people. I remember scrolling through her feed one lunch break, eating my tuna sandwich. I saw a photo of Tiffany holding a glass of champagne on a yacht. Captioned, "Hard work pays off, self-made." I knew for a fact that the yacht belonged to a friend of a friend she had met at a club, and the champagne was likely ginger ale because she couldn't afford the real bottle on the menu. But her followers, all 50,000 of them, ate it up. They commented on her grind, her hustle, her glow. They sent her digital gifts, little icons of roses and diamonds that converted into pennies in her bank account, funding her delusions 1 cent at a time. The friction between our worlds came to a head 2 years ago, in an incident involving my car. At the time, I was driving a 10-year-old sedan. It was reliable, rusted at the wheel wells, and fully paid for. I had left it at my parents' house for a weekend while I went on a site visit to New York with my firm. When I returned, the car was gone. I found it 3 hours later at a tow yard. The front end was accordion pleated against a highway divider. Tiffany had taken my keys without asking because her vibe that night required a getaway car, and she had texted while driving. She walked away without a scratch. My car was totaled. When I confronted her in the living room, shaking with a mixture of relief that she was alive and fury that she was so reckless, my parents intervened, but not to discipline her. "Grace, stop shouting," my mother had said, pouring tea as if we were discussing the weather. "It is just a car. Material things can be replaced." "She could have killed someone," I yelled. "And she didn't even have insurance because she is not on my policy. I am out $5,000. Mom!" "She is young," my father grunted from behind his newspaper. "She made a mistake. Don't be so petty. You have a good job. You can buy another one. Don't hold this over your sister's head. It is unbecoming. I ended up paying the tow fees. I ended up paying the fines. I ended up buying a new used car. And Tiffany? She posted a selfie from the hospital waiting room, where she went just to check for trauma, with a neck brace she didn't need. Captioned, "Survivors are the strongest. God gives his toughest battles to his toughest soldiers." She got 10,000 likes. I got a bill. But the real rot in the family foundation wasn't exposed until 6 months ago. I had stopped by the house to drop off a box of vitamins my mother had hinted she wanted. The house was empty, but the mail was on the counter. I am not a snoop, but a letter from the bank caught my eye because it was stamped in bold red letters. Final notice. I opened it. My heart stopped. My parents were 6 months behind on their mortgage. The house was in pre-foreclosure. But that wasn't the worst part. Underneath the mortgage notice was a credit card statement for a black obsidian card issued in my father's name. The balance due was $50,000. I scanned the charges. They were nauseating. $500 for a spa day, $1,200 for a designer handbag, $300 for a sushi dinner. These weren't household expenses. These were Tiffany's expenses. My sister had been living like a Kardashian on my father's credit, and he had been letting her do it, digging a hole so deep it was about to swallow the house they had lived in for 30 years. I waited for them to come home when they walked through the door, laughing about something Tiffany had said. I slammed the papers onto the dining table. "What is this?" I demanded. The laughter died. My father looked at the papers and his face went gray, but my mother's eyes narrowed into slits. "You have no right to go through our mail," Sylvia hissed. "I have every right when you are about to be homeless," I shot back. "Tiffany has spent $50,000 on garbage. Dad, you are going to lose the house. Why did you let her do this?" "I needed it for my brand," Tiffany screamed, stepping forward. Her face twisted in an ugly snarl that she never showed on camera. "You don't understand investment. I am building an empire. Once I get a brand deal, I will pay it all back in a week." "You are 26 and you are unemployed," I shouted. "This isn't an empire. It is theft." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I looked at my parents. "Listen to me. I can help. I have some savings." This was before I told them about the $1 million. "I can pay off the arrears on the mortgage. I can help structure a payment plan for the credit card." My parents' faces softened. Hope lit up their eyes. "But," I continued, holding up a finger, "there is a condition. Tiffany gets a job, a real job, waitress, retail, receptionist, I don't care. She cuts up the credit card, and she contributes to the household. I will not pour my money into a bucket with a hole in the bottom." The silence that followed was heavy and cold. "So that is it?" My father sneered, his lip curling. "You will help us, but only if you get to control us? You think because you have a little money you can come in here and lord it over us? You are so arrogant. Grace, so condescending." "She is just jealous," Tiffany spat. "She is jealous because I am chasing my dreams and she is a corporate slave." "We don't need your charity if it comes with strings," Sylvia said. Turning her back on me, "We will figure it out. We always do." I left that day feeling like the villain. I felt guilty for imposing conditions on my own family. I didn't know then that they didn't need to figure it out, because they had already found a solution. They had found me. I found out later that my father had a drinking buddy named Carl who worked at the regional bank where I kept my primary savings account. Privacy laws meant nothing to them. Over a few beers, Richard had likely complained about money, and Carl had likely tapped a few keys and whistled low. "Your daughter Grace is sitting on a gold mine." Richie. 7 figures. That was the turning point. That was when I went from being the disappointment to being the target. They didn't want my help with conditions. They wanted my harvest without the labor. The final warning came 1 week before the birthday party. I was at my desk at Vanguard, buried under blueprints. When the receptionist called to say my sister was in the lobby, Tiffany walked into my office wearing a trench coat that looked like it belonged in a noir film and sunglasses she didn't remove. She sat in the leather chair opposite my desk and didn't offer a greeting. "I need you to sign something," she said, sliding a piece of paper across the glass. It was a loan application for a personal business loan, $15,000. She needed a guarantor. "No," I said, pushing it back without reading the fine print. "Grace, come on," she whined, the noir facade dropping to reveal the petulant child beneath. "It is just a bridge loan. I have a sponsorship coming in from a detox tea company. I just need to buy some equipment to shoot the promo." I said, "No, Tiffany, I told you, get a job, and I will help you. Until then, the Bank of Grace is closed." She stared at me for a long time. Then, a slow, chilling smile spread across her face. It wasn't the smile of someone who was defeated. It was the smile of someone who held a royal flush and was just waiting for the river card to be dealt. "You really think you are untouchable, don't you?" she said softly. "You think you are so safe in your glass tower." "I think I earn my living," I replied calmly. "You should try it." She stood up and buttoned her coat. "You are going to regret this. Grace, you had a chance to be a good sister. You had a chance to help the family when we asked nicely. Don't say I didn't warn you." She walked out, leaving a scent of overly sweet perfume and impending doom in the air. 2 days later, the letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope with no return address, left at the front desk of my apartment building. Inside was a single sheet of printer paper with one sentence typed in the center: "Do not go to the party." I stared at the words. My first thought wasn't my parents. It wasn't Tiffany. My mind immediately went to the firm. I was up for partner. I was competing against a guy named Steven in the urban planning division who was known for playing dirty. I assumed it was him. I assumed it was a mind game to make me paranoid, to make me miss my own celebration and look unstable to the partners. I crumbled the paper and threw it in the trash. "Nice try, Steven," I muttered. I was so naive. I was a structural engineer who understood how steel beams held up skyscrapers, but I didn't understand the basic structural engineering of a toxic family. I believed that blood was a binding agent, stronger than concrete. I didn't realize that in my family, blood was just the paint they used to cover the rot. I thought the worst thing my family could do was ignore me. I never imagined they would stage a public execution. I never imagined that when Tiffany said I would regret it, she wasn't making an empty threat. She was reading the prologue to my destruction. So, I ignored the warning. I put on my midnight blue dress, I called a cab, and I rode toward the Emerald Room, believing I was heading toward a coronation, while completely unaware that I was actually walking voluntarily onto the scaffold. The hum of the projector was the sound of a guillotine blade being hoisted slowly to the top of its frame. I sat frozen on the wooden stool, my hands clammy against my silk dress, watching as the blank white light on the screen behind my parents flickered. Then, with a digital stutter, the first slide appeared. It was not a collage of baby photos. It was not a montage of my graduation or my first day at work. It was a single word, written in a violent, bleeding red font against a stark black background: fraud. The word seemed to vibrate in the air, towering over me, labeling me. A gasp rippled through the 80 people sitting in the Emerald Room. It was a synchronized intake of breath. The sound of a scandal landing. Richard Harland, the man I had called Dad for 3 decades, adjusted his tie. He looked like a CEO about to announce a bankruptcy, solemn and pained. He pointed a laser pointer at the screen, the red dot dancing frantically over the word like a sniper's scope. "We value truth in this family," Richard began, his voice amplified and booming. "We value heritage, and for 30 years, we have lived a lie that we maintain to protect an innocent child. But that child is no longer innocent. She is a woman who has deceived us all." He clicked a remote in his hand. The screen changed. It was a document. I squinted against the glare. It looked medical. There were rows of genetic markers, colorful bar graphs, and a lot of technical jargon. But at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, was a summary that Richard read aloud. savoring every syllable. Subject: Grace Lockridge. Relation to Richard Harland, 0%. Relation to Sylvia Harland, 0%. Probability of paternity, 0. My heart stopped beating, I am sure of it. For a full second. My blood ceased to flow. The room spun. I gripped the seat of the stool, my fingernails digging into the wood. "What?" I mouthed. No sound came out. I had never doubted my lineage. My birth certificate, the one I used to get my driver's license and my passport, listed Richard and Sylvia Harland as my biological parents. I had their last name. I lived in their house. I had always wondered why I didn't look like them, why I was tall and dark-haired while they were stocky and fair. But I assumed it was a recessive gene, a throwback to a grandparent I never met. "She is not our daughter," Richard announced to the crowd, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. She never was. The audience erupted. The silence shattered into 1,000 fragments of whispered gossip. I saw my Aunt Linda cover her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. I saw the neighbors leaning in, hungry for the details. Sylvia stepped forward then. She took the microphone from Richard, her movements slow and heavy, as if she were carrying the weight of the world. She looked at me, and her eyes welled up with tears. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. "We didn't want to shame her," Sylvia said, her voice trembling just enough to sound heartbroken. "We wanted to protect her. We found her in 1996. She was in a state orphanage, abandoned, sick, and alone. No one wanted her. She was a difficult baby," they said, prone to screaming fits. "But Richard and I couldn't leave her there. We had just lost a pregnancy. We were grieving. We took her in out of pity." "That is a lie," I screamed. The words tore out of my throat, raw and burning. "You told me I was born at Chicago Mercy Hospital. I have the papers." "Forged," Richard interjected smoothly, cutting me off. "To give you a normal life, to give you the dignity of a name, we paid thousands to lawyers to seal your records, to make you feel like you belonged. And how did you repay us?" Sylvia wiped a tear from her cheek, smudging her mascara perfectly. "We tried to love her. God knows we tried. But bad blood, it tells. It always tells." She turned to the audience, engaging them, drawing them into her fabricated reality. From the time she was 5, she was stealing. Sylvia lied. "Money from my purse, jewelry. We covered for her. We told the neighbors it was misplaced. We didn't want her to be labeled a criminal before she even started school. But it got worse." I sat there, shaking my head violently. "I never stole anything. I worked. I mowed lawns. I babysat." She became angry, Sylvia continued, ignoring me completely. "She was jealous of our biological daughter, Tiffany. She hated Tiffany because Tiffany was well. Tiffany was ours. Grace would break Tiffany's toys. She would sabotage her schoolwork. It was a nightmare in our own home." I looked at Tiffany. She was beaming. She had moved the camera closer, practically shoving the lens into my face. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the viewer count. "Did you guys hear that?" Tiffany said to her phone, her voice shrill and excited. "My parents are literal saints. They adopted her from a dumpster, basically, and she treated them like trash. Read these comments. Guys, they are brutal." She started reading them aloud, her voice amplifying the cruelty of strangers. User Truthbomb says, "Look at her face. You can tell she has no soul. Definitely a sociopath." User Rich Girl Summer says, "Imagine being adopted and still being a brat. I would have kicked her out at 18. User Chi-Town Architect asks, "Is that Grace Lockridge from Vanguard? Wow, I wouldn't trust her to design a doghouse if she is this unstable." That last comment hit me like a physical blow. I looked toward the back of the room, where my colleagues were sitting. Sarah, my mentee, the girl I had spent hours teaching how to use drafting software, was looking at me with wide, frightened eyes. She wasn't looking at me like a mentor anymore. She was looking at me like I was a contagion. David, the project manager, was whispering something to the head of HR. The HR director was frowning. tapping something into her phone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the shock. My contract at Vanguard Horizons had a morality clause. It was standard for partners. Any public scandal, any behavior that brought disrepute to the firm, was grounds for immediate termination and forfeiture of equity. My parents weren't just humiliating me. They were systematically dismantling my future. They were nuking my career from orbit. "She claims to be successful," Richard boomed, taking the mic back. "She walks around in expensive suits, driving a nice car. But do you know who paid for her education? We did. Do you know who bailed her out when she got into trouble with credit cards in college? We did. I paid for my own college," I yelled. Standing up, my legs were shaking, but I forced myself to stand. "I worked 3 jobs. I had scholarships. You didn't pay a dime." "Lies," Richard said simply. "Pathological lying. It is part of her condition. We have documentation." He clicked the remote again. The screen filled with images of handwritten letters. The paper looked old, crinkled, and stained. The handwriting was jagged, angry, written in heavy black marker. Richard read from the screen. "I hate them. I hate living here. I wish they were dead so I could take their money. Tiffany is a pig. I'm going to make them pay." He looked at the audience, his face a mask of sorrow. "We found these in her room when she was 16, a diary of hate. We were terrified. We thought she might hurt us in our sleep, but we still kept her, because we loved her." I stared at the screen. The handwriting was familiar, but not because it was mine. It was the handwriting of someone trying to look like a chaotic teenager. But the loops on the Y and the G, I knew those loops. I looked at Tiffany. She was struggling to suppress a laugh. It was her handwriting. When we were kids, Tiffany used to write fake love letters to herself from imaginary boys to make her friends jealous. She used that same disguised block lettering. She had forged these entries. They had spent weeks, maybe months, fabricating evidence of a troubled childhood that never existed. "That is a forgery!" I shouted, pointing at the screen. "Tiffany wrote that. Look at the G. That is how she writes." I turned to the crowd, desperate for someone to believe me. "Ask Aunt Linda. Aunt Linda, you remember? I was the one who came over and helped you weed your garden when Uncle Bob broke his hip. I was the one who brought you soup. Tiffany never lifted a finger. You know me." Aunt Linda looked away. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Well," she mumbled, loud enough for the people around her to hear, "you were always a bit intense, Grace, a bit quiet. It is always the quiet ones, isn't it?" The betrayal was absolute. The neighbors who had praised my report cards, the relatives who had eaten my cooking at Thanksgiving, they were all rewriting their memories to fit the narrative on the screen. It was easier to believe the scandalous lie than the boring truth. It was more entertaining to believe I was a monster than to accept that my parents were sociopaths. "And now," Richard said, his voice hardening, "now we come to the present. For the last 10 years, Grace has abandoned us. She moved to the city. She got her high-flying job. She forgot the people who saved her from the orphanage. 'I send you $2,000 a month,' I screamed. I grabbed the microphone stand that was near me, intending to amplify my voice, to drown out their lies. I leaned into the mic. 'I have bank statements. I have sent you over $200,000 in the last decade.'" Silence. The microphone was dead. I tapped it frantically. Nothing. I looked at the sound booth at the back of the room. A technician was sitting there, arms crossed, looking at Richard. My father had cut the feed. "You see?" Sylvia said into her working microphone. "She becomes violent when confronted. She tries to dominate the conversation. She has no remorse." I stood there, holding the dead microphone, panting. I was trapped in a glass box. I could scream, but no one would hear me. They had controlled every variable. The guest list, the technology, the narrative, the evidence. It was a perfect ambush. Tiffany walked right up to the edge of the stage. She looked up at me, the ring light reflecting in her eyes like demonic halos. "You are trending, sis," she whispered, low enough that only I could hear. Number 1 on the local feed. Everyone hates you. You are done. Richard cleared his throat. The room fell silent again. He had one more slide. We are not vengeful people, Richard said, adjusting his cuffs. We are not asking for an apology. An apology cannot fix 30 years of emotional abuse. An apology cannot pay for the therapy Sylvia has needed. An apology cannot restore the peace of our home. He clicked the remote. The final slide appeared. It wasn't a picture. It wasn't a document. It was a spreadsheet. A complex, detailed financial ledger with columns for dates, expenses, and interest rates. We want justice, Richard declared. And in this country, justice is quantified. We have calculated the cost of raising a child that was not ours, the food, the clothing, the shelter, the medical bills, the emotional distress. He turned to look at me. And for the first time that night, he didn't look like a disappointed father. He looked like a debt collector. We want our investment back. Grace, we are presenting you with a bill for the life we bought you. I looked at the numbers on the screen. They were staggering. They had itemized my existence. Every gallon of milk I drank in 1998, every pair of shoes I wore in 2004. They had even charged me for rent in my childhood bedroom starting from the age of 18. I felt a coldness settle in my chest, a numbness that replaced the panic. This wasn't about hate. It wasn't about disappointment. It was about the $1 million I had told them about at dinner. They had built this entire theater of cruelty, this elaborate stage of humiliation, for one simple purpose. They were shaking me down. They were holding my reputation hostage, dangling my career over the edge of a cliff, and demanding a ransom. You want money, I said, my voice quiet in the dead air, audible only to the front row. Richard smiled. It was a terrifying, triumphant smile. We want what is owed, and we won't let you leave this room until the debt is settled. I looked around the room one last time. The exits were blocked by hotel staff who looked suspiciously like bouncers. The audience was waiting for the kill. My colleagues were typing resignation recommendations on their phones. I was alone, completely, utterly alone. Or so I thought. In the back corner, in the shadows where the light didn't reach. The man in the sunglasses stopped twisting his ring. He sat up straighter. He took off his sunglasses, folding them slowly with a deliberate, metallic click that somehow cut through the silence of the room. He placed them in his breast pocket, and then he began to clap. It was a slow, solitary applause. Clap, clap, clap. Heads turned. Richard frowned, squinting into the darkness. Sylvia faltered. Tiffany lowered her phone slightly. The man stood up. He was tall, taller than anyone else in the room. He buttoned his jacket with a casual elegance that spoke of immense power. I didn't know who he was, but as he stepped out of the shadows and began walking down the center aisle toward the stage, I felt a strange vibration in my chest, a resonance, like a tuning fork recognizing its twin. My parents had set the perfect trap. They had accounted for every variable, every exit, every defense I could possibly mount. But they had made one fatal calculation error. They didn't know who was in the audience. The applause from the back of the room was a rhythmic, solitary sound, but my father, Richard, was too intoxicated by the proximity of his payday to let a single heckler derail his grand finale. He glanced briefly at the approaching figure in the shadows, dismissed him as a drunk guest or a confused hotel patron, and turned his attention back to the screen that loomed over me like a digital tombstone. The show had to go on. The trap had to be sprung before the audience realized they were witnessing a crime, not a performance. "Pay attention, Grace," Richard commanded, his voice snapping me back to the horror in front of me. "The numbers do not lie." The slide changed again, and what appeared was not just a document. It was a monstrosity of accounting. It was a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, formatted with the cold, clinical precision of a corporate audit, titled Cost of Maintenance and Upkeep, Grace Lockridge, 1996 to 2014. I stared at the grid. my eyes struggling to process the sheer insanity of what I was reading. They had not just estimated a lump sum, they had itemized my existence. They had broken down my childhood into billable hours and consumable goods. Row 3 read, Infant Formula and Sustenance, 1996 to 1998. The figure in the next column was adjusted for inflation. Row 10 read, Utilities Allocation, 25% of household total. They had charged me for the heat I needed to not freeze to death in my bedroom. They had charged me for the water I used to brush my teeth. They had charged me for the electricity that powered the lamp I used to study until midnight, so I could win the scholarships they never praised. It got worse. As my eyes scanned down the list, the items shifted from petty to psychotic. Row 42. Transportation services. Chauffeur fee for school drop-offs. My father had driven me to school on his way to work. He was now charging me Uber rates for those rides, retroactive for 12 years. Row 55. Clothing and aesthetics. This was particularly galling. Considering I had worn Tiffany's cast-offs for most of my life, they were charging me full retail price for clothes that were already used when I received them. But it was the bottom section of the spreadsheet that made bile rise in my throat. It was labeled Intangible Damages. Row 80. Parental stress and anxiety. Row 81. Loss of social mobility due to childcare obligations. Row 82. Emotional wear and tear. They had put a price tag on their annoyance. They had calculated a dollar value for every time I cried as a baby, every time I got sick and needed medicine, every time my presence prevented them from going on a vacation. They had monetized their own lack of love. Richard tapped the screen with his laser pointer, the red dot hovering over the final bolded figure at the bottom right. $845,000, Richard announced. He said the number slowly, savoring the vowels. And that is being generous. That is calculating at a modest 4% annual interest rate. If we were to charge you the market rate for a personal loan, this number would be double. But we are fair people. Grace, we are reasonable. You are charging me for being alive? I whispered. The shock was starting to fracture, revealing a core of cold, hard realization beneath. We are charging you for services rendered, Sylvia corrected, stepping forward with a sheaf of papers in her hand. Her voice was steady, businesslike. You are an architect, Grace. You understand contracts. You understand that when you build a house, someone has to pay for the bricks. Well, we built you, and you never paid for the bricks. She placed the papers on the small table next to my stool. It was a thick legal document, bound with a blue cover. Beside it, she placed a heavy, expensive fountain pen, likely one I had given my father for Christmas a few years ago. This is a settlement agreement, Sylvia explained, smoothing the cover with her manicured hand. It outlines the terms of repayment, since you do not have $800,000 in cash on you. We are willing to accept assets in lieu of payment. I looked down at the document. The text was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Transfer of deed, liquidation of holdings, power of attorney. You want my apartment, I said, my voice flat. It is a start, Richard said, shrugging. The equity in your apartment should cover about $200,000. The rest, well, we know about your savings, Grace. We know about the buy-in money. The $1 million. Everything suddenly clicked into a terrifyingly sharp focus. The dinner 4 weeks ago, the sudden interest in my career, the questions about my liquidity. They didn't care about my promotion. They didn't care about my partnership. They had been salivating over that account balance like starving dogs. They knew I had exactly enough money to cover this insane, fabricated debt, with a little left over for Tiffany to burn. You want to bankrupt me, I said, looking up at Richard. You want to take the money I saved to become a partner. You want to destroy my career so you can pay off your mortgage and Tiffany's credit cards. It is not your money, Tiffany chimed in from the side of the stage. She had lowered her phone slightly, her face twisted in a sneer of pure greed. It is family money. You owe us. You occupied space in our house for 18 years. You ate our food. You breathed our air. That wasn't free? Sweetie, nothing in life is free. I am not signing that, I said, pushing the papers away. This is extortion. It is illegal. A man stepped out from the shadows of the stage wing. I hadn't noticed him before. He was short, balding, wearing a suit that looked like it had been slept in, and carrying a briefcase that had seen better days. He looked like the kind of lawyer you hired from a billboard on the side of a highway. Actually, Ms. Lockridge, the lawyer said, his voice oily and nasal. It is a perfectly binding arbitration agreement. I am Mr. Finch, representing the Harlan family, and while you are free to decline to sign, my clients are also free to release the supplementary evidence to the relevant authorities. Mr. Finch opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He held it up for the audience to see. In here, he announced. We have sworn affidavits from your family detailing your history of theft, deception, and instability. We have the letters you wrote threatening them. We have testimony regarding your mental health. He tapped the envelope against his palm. If you do not sign the settlement today, Mr. Finch continued, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes, my instructions are to mail copies of this packet to the Ethics Board of the American Institute of Architects. We will also send copies to the senior partners at Vanguard Horizons, and of course, to the local press. My blood ran cold. In the world of high-stakes architecture, reputation was currency. We managed millions of dollars of client money. We were responsible for the safety of thousands of people. A hint of instability, a whiff of scandal involving fraud or theft, would trigger the morality clause in my contract instantly. I would be fired. I would be disbarred from the association. I would never work in this industry again. They had me checkmated. If I didn't sign, they would burn my career to the ground, and I would lose the partnership anyway. If I did sign, I would lose the money. But I might be able to salvage my job, though I would be starting over from zero at age 30. This is a robbery, I said, my voice shaking. You are mugging me in front of 80 people. We are collecting a debt, Richard roared, losing his patience. He slammed his hand down on the podium. Sign the damn paper. Grace, you ungrateful wretch. After everything we did for you, we could have left you in that orphanage to rot. We gave you a home. We gave you a name. And you hoard your money while your sister suffers? While we struggle? I struggled, I yelled back, standing up and facing him. I ate instant noodles for 5 years. I walked to work in the snow to save bus fare. Where were you then? Where were you when I was working 3 jobs in college? You were buying Tiffany a new nose. Don't you bring me into this, Tiffany shrieked. My rhinoplasty was medically necessary, and at least I am actually their daughter. You are just a stray dog they felt sorry for. Sign it, Sylvia hissed, leaning in close. Her face was a mask of cold fury. Sign it, and we let you walk out of here. Refuse, and I promise you, by tomorrow morning, you will be the most hated woman in Chicago. You will lose your job, your friends, and your dignity. We will ruin you. Grace, we will leave you with nothing. I looked at the pen. It was heavy, black lacquer with gold trim. I remembered buying it for Richard. I had saved for 2 months to buy it. I had wrapped it in gold paper. I had written a card that said, "To the best dad in the world." He was using it to sign my death warrant. The despair that had been crushing me for the last hour began to shift. It condensed, hardened, and crystallized into something else. It turned into a cold, quiet rage. I looked at the spreadsheet again. $845,000. I looked at Tiffany, who was smirking at me, waiting for her inheritance to be transferred. Just sign it, sis, she taunted. Think of it as the fee for buying the Harlan name. You gotta use it for 30 years. Now the lease is up. The lease is up. I looked at the audience. They were silent, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. My colleagues were pale. They knew what was happening. They knew I was being extorted. But they did nothing. No one moved. No one spoke. I was completely alone. I reached out and took the pen. My hand was trembling, but not from fear. It was trembling from a revulsion so deep it felt like my skin was trying to crawl off my bones. I was disgusted by them. I was disgusted by myself for ever loving them. I was disgusted by the years I had wasted trying to buy their affection with obedience. I uncapped the pen. The click echoed in the silence. Mr. Finch, the lawyer, pointed a greasy finger at the signature line on the bottom of the page. Right here, Ms. Lockridge. Press hard. It is in triplicate. I lowered the pen to the paper. I could feel Richard and Sylvia holding their breath. I could feel the greed radiating off them like heat from a furnace. They were already spending the money in their heads. They were already paying off the mortgage, booking the cruises, buying the new cars. I pressed the nib to the paper. The ink began to bleed into the fiber, a tiny black dot that marked the end of my life as I knew it. That is a good girl, Sylvia whispered, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. Do the right thing. I was about to sign. I was about to sign away $1 million and 10 years of sweat and blood just to make the pain stop. But just as I started to form the first loop of the letter G, a voice cut through the stagnant air of the room. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a timbre of such absolute, crushing authority that it made the microphone feedback seem like a whisper. Don't you dare sign that trash. The ink from the fountain pen had just begun to bleed into the paper, forming a small, jagged Rorschach test of my surrender, when the command cracked through the air. It was not a scream. It was a statement delivered with the low, resonant frequency of a cello string struck in a silent cathedral. It carried a weight that made the very air in the emerald room seem to vibrate. My hand froze. The tip of the pen hovered millimeters above the signature line. The gold nib, trembling like a suspended guillotine blade. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrified. Richard, whose face had been flushed with the anticipation of victory, blinked. His mouth hung open, a half-formed gloat dying on his tongue. Sylvia's head snapped toward the back of the room so fast I heard the vertebrae in her neck crack. Tiffany, who had been zooming in on the document to capture the moment of my financial suicide, lowered her phone, her brow furrowed in annoyance. "Excuse me?" Richard blustered into the microphone, the sound popping unpleasantly. "We are in the middle of a private legal proceeding. Who said that?" I turned my head slowly, my neck stiff with tension. The man in the black suit was no longer sitting in the shadows. He was standing, and he was moving. He walked down the center aisle of the emerald room, not with the hurried pace of an intruder, but with the leisurely, terrifying confidence of a man walking through his own living room. The guests in the aisle seats actually shrank back as he passed, pulling their legs in, instinctively making themselves smaller in his presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his bespoke suit in a way that suggested raw physical power contained beneath expensive wool. "I said," the man repeated, his voice growing clearer and more imposing as he approached the stage. "Do not sign that paper, Grace. It is not worth the pulp it is printed on." Richard's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He was a small man who felt big when he was bullying his daughter, but confronted with another alpha male, his insecurity flared into aggression. "Security!" Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the approaching figure. "Where is security? Get this man out of here. He is trespassing on a private event." I looked toward the double doors where 2 uniformed security guards had been standing all night. The same guards who had blocked my exit earlier. They looked at Richard, then they looked at the man walking down the aisle. They did not move. In fact, one of them reached up and respectfully touched the brim of his cap. "I said get him out!" Richard shrieked, his voice cracking. "I am paying for this room. I demand you remove him." The man ignored Richard completely. He didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on me. He reached the base of the stage and walked up the steps, the heavy thud of his dress shoes on the wood echoing like a gavel. He stopped 3 feet away from me, up close. The energy radiating off him was overwhelming. It smelled of sea salt, old leather, and a power so ancient it felt like gravity. He reached up with a slow, deliberate hand and removed his sunglasses. The air left my lungs. I had spent 30 years looking in the mirror and wondering where I came from. I had spent 30 years wondering why my eyes were not the watery blue of Richard's or the muddy hazel of Sylvia's. I had spent 30 years staring at my own eyes, a unique, piercing shade of gray, like a storm cloud just before it breaks. I was looking at those same eyes now. They were set in a face that was weathered, lined with age and possibly tragedy, but they were my eyes, the arch of the eyebrow, the sharp intelligence in the iris, the flecks of silver near the pupil. It was like looking at a male version of myself aged forward 25 years. The man folded his sunglasses and tucked them into his breast pocket. He looked at the fountain pen in my hand, then at the lawyer. "Mr. Finch." "You?" the man said to the lawyer. His voice was calm, but it was the calm of a predator deciding which artery to sever. "You are practicing law in the state of Illinois with a license that was suspended 6 months ago for malpractice. Aren't you, Mr. Finch?" The lawyer turned pale. He clutched his briefcase to his chest like a shield. I don't know who you think you are, but I am Elias Sterling," the man said. The name hit the room like a physical shockwave. I heard a gasp from the back row. I heard the clatter of a fork dropping onto a plate. Even Tiffany dropped her phone. It landed on the carpet with a dull thud, but she didn't bend to pick it up. She just stared, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. Elias Sterling. The name was legendary in Chicago. He wasn't just a businessman. He was an institution. He was the real estate tycoon who had reshaped the city skyline. He owned the skyscrapers, the marinas, and the luxury condos. He was a ghost in the media, a man who rarely gave interviews and was known for a ruthlessness that made Wall Street bankers weep. He also owned the Chicago Grand Hotel. We were standing in his building, and, as the blood drained from my face, another realization hit me. Elias Sterling was the majority shareholder of the investment group that backed Vanguard Horizons. He wasn't just a stranger. In a very real sense, he was my boss's boss's boss. Sylvia let out a strangled noise, something between a squeak and a sob. She looked as if she were about to faint. "Mr. Sterling," she stammered, her voice an octave higher than usual. We didn't think, we sent an invitation to your office as a courtesy because we are renting the Emerald Room we never dreamed." I realized then the depth of their vanity. They had invited the biggest name in the city just to have the invitation on their guest list, to show off to the neighbors that they moved in high circles. They had never expected the recluse billionaire to actually show up to a birthday party for a nobody architect. Elias finally turned his eyes to Sylvia. The look he gave her was not human. It was the look a boot gives to an ant. "You invited me," Elias said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You sent an invitation to my office regarding the birthday of Grace Lockridge. You thought I wouldn't notice the name. You thought 30 years was enough time for me to forget." "We," Richard tried to step forward, but Elias held up one hand, and my father stopped dead in his tracks as if he had hit a wall. "I have been sitting in the back of this room for 45 minutes, Elias said, addressing the room but keeping his focus on the Harlans. "I have listened to you list the costs of raising a child, milk, diapers, heating. I have watched you monetize a human life." He took a step closer to Richard. Richard actually took a step back, nearly tripping over the projector cord. "You spoke of debts," Elias said softly. "You spoke of what is owed. I think you are confused about the definition of debt, Richard, because from where I am standing, the ledger is not balanced in your favor." "She owes us!" Richard cried out, desperate to regain control of the narrative, though his voice shook. "We took her in. We have the DNA results. She is not our blood. She is nothing to us." "That," Elias said, his voice cutting like a razor, "is the only truthful thing you have said tonight." He turned back to me. The hardness in his face vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of such profound, agonizing sorrow that it made my chest ache just to look at him. He looked at my hair, my face, my hands. He looked at me as if he were trying to memorize me, or perhaps trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with a ghost from his memory. "They are right, Grace," Elias said gently. "You are not their daughter. You do not have one drop of Harlan blood in your veins." He paused, and the room was so silent you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "Because my daughter," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "could never share blood with people so small, so petty, and so undeniably vile." My brain was misfiring. I was trying to process the data, but the logic circuits were fried. Elias Sterling, the eyes, the timing, the way he looked at me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Elias stepped closer. He didn't care about the 80 people watching. He didn't care about the live stream that was likely still running on the floor where Tiffany had dropped her phone. He closed the distance between us until he was standing right in front of me. He reached out and placed his hands on my shoulders. His grip was firm, warm, and grounding. It was the first time in my life I had been touched by a parent without feeling like I was being measured or pushed away. "I am the man who lost you," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. "I am the man who has spent every single day of the last 30 years looking for a girl with gray eyes and a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon on her left shoulder blade," I gasped. My hand flew to my shoulder, covering the silk of my dress. No one knew about that birthmark. It was hidden. I never wore sleeveless tops. Even my ex-boyfriends hadn't paid much attention to it. "How?" I started, but the tears I had been holding back all night finally spilled over. "I am your father, Grace," Elias said. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. The reaction in the room was chaotic. People were standing up. My colleagues were whispering furiously to each other. Sarah had her hand over her mouth. The neighbors were looking from me to Elias. Seeing the resemblance that was now so obvious it was blinding. Sylvia let out a wail. "No, that is impossible. They told us you were dead. They said the parents died in the crash." Elias turned his head slightly, acknowledging her outburst without releasing my shoulders. "You believed what was convenient for you. Sylvia, you saw a tragedy, and you saw an opportunity. You didn't check for survivors. You just took the prize." He looked back at me, and his thumb brushed away a tear tracking down my cheek. "I was in a coma for 6 months after the accident," he explained to me, his voice low and urgent, as if he needed me to understand this above all else. "When I woke up, my wife, your mother, was gone, and my baby girl was missing. The police said the river took you. They said the current was too strong. They stopped searching after 2 weeks." He took a breath that shuddered in his chest. "I never stopped. I hired private investigators. I hired data analysts. I spent millions chasing leads that went nowhere. I thought I had lost you forever." "Then how?" I choked out. "How did you find me?" "You applied for a grant," he said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "6 months ago, the Vanguard Library Project. You submitted a biography with your application. You didn't include a photo, but you listed your birthday, and you listed your birth hospital as Chicago Mercy." He glanced at Richard with cold fury. "A hospital that burned down in 1995, 1 year before you were supposedly born there. The forgery was sloppy. Richard, amateur." Elias turned back to me. "My team flagged the discrepancy. We dug deeper. We found a high school yearbook photo. And there you were, my face, her eyes." He looked at the spreadsheet still projected on the screen behind us, the itemized bill of my childhood. He looked at the total, $845,000. He laughed, a short, dark sound that had no humor in it. "They want to charge you for existing," he said. "They want to charge you for the privilege of surviving their neglect." He took the legal settlement from my hand, the one I had almost signed, and tore it in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping was louder than the microphone feedback. He tore it again, and again, until it was just confetti raining down onto the stage floor. You don't owe them a penny, Grace, Elias said. But they owe you everything. They owe you 30 years of a life that was stolen. They owe you for every tear, every hungry night, every moment you felt you weren't enough. He turned to the crowd. He raised his voice, addressing the room with the authority of a king in his own court. This party is over, Elias declared. The bar is closed. The kitchen is closed. I suggest you all leave immediately, because what happens next is not going to be a celebration. It is going to be a crime scene investigation. He looked at the security guards. Lock the doors. No one from the Harlan family leaves this room until the police arrive. Police? Richard squeaked. Now, hold on, Mr. Sterling. This is a misunderstanding. We saved her. We raised her. You can't call the police on us. I can, Elias said calmly. And I will. Kidnapping, fraud, extortion. And that is just what I saw in the last hour. He turned back to me, and the fire in his eyes softened into an ember of pure, unconditional love. He pulled me into a hug. It was awkward at first, two strangers trying to fit into the roles of father and daughter. But then I melted into it. I smelled the wool of his suit and the starch of his shirt. I felt the solid beat of his heart against my cheek. I am sorry, he whispered into my hair, his voice cracking. I am so sorry I was late. I am so sorry I wasn't there to protect you from these monsters, but I am here now. Gracie, I am here now, and I promise you, they will never hurt you again. I stood there, wrapped in the arms of a billionaire stranger who felt like home, while my parents screamed at security guards and my sister frantically tried to delete her livestream history. I looked over Elias's shoulder at the ruins of my 30th birthday party, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a fraud. I felt like I had finally been found. The warmth of Elias Sterling's embrace was the only thing anchoring me to the earth, but after a moment, he gently pulled away. His hands lingered on my shoulders for a split second, a silent reassurance, before he turned back to the stage. The tenderness in his eyes hardened instantly into the cold, calculated look of a man about to demolish a competitor's hostile takeover. He raised a hand, snapping his fingers once. It was a sharp, percussive sound that cut through the murmurs of the confused crowd. "Project the file," Elias commanded, looking up at the control booth. The technician, who had previously been obeying my father's orders to cut the microphone, didn't hesitate. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so violently that the very air seemed to bend toward Elias. On the massive screen, Richard's grotesque spreadsheet, the bill charging me for my own existence, glitched. The image of the $845,000 distorted, tore apart, and then vanished. In its place, a new document appeared. It was a scanned image of a police report, yellowed with age, dated November 12, 1996. Next to it was a photograph of a mangled black sedan overturned in a snowbank. "Let us talk about the cost of acquisition," Elias said, his voice echoing off the walls. He walked slowly toward Richard and Sylvia, who were now huddled together near the podium like rats caught in a floodlight. "You showed the audience what it cost to keep Grace. Now, I am going to show them how you acquired her." He pointed to the photo of the car crash. 30 years ago, my wife and I were driving home from a gala," Elias began, his voice devoid of emotion, which made the story even more terrifying. "A drunk driver in a pickup truck crossed the center line on an icy road. We went over the guardrail. My wife died on impact. I was thrown from the vehicle and found unconscious 50 yards away in the ravine." A hush fell over the room. I stared at the photo, my stomach churning. That was where I came from. That wreckage was my origin story. "In the back seat," Elias continued, "was our 6-month-old daughter. She was strapped into a car seat. When the police arrived, the car seat was empty, the doors were open. They assumed the current of the nearby river had dragged the baby away. They dredged that river for weeks. They found nothing." He turned to look at Richard. "But the river didn't take my daughter. You did." Richard's face was the color of old ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Tell them what you were doing that night. Richard, Elias challenged. Tell them what your job was in 1996. Richard stayed silent, sweat beading on his forehead. He was a paramedic, Elias answered for him. And Sylvia was an emergency medical technician. They were the first responders on the scene, the very first ambulance to arrive. A collective gasp went through the audience. I felt bile rise in my throat. They weren't just random people who found me. They were the people sworn to save lives. You found the baby in the snow, Elias said, piecing the narrative together with forensic precision. She was alive, miraculously unharmed. You should have radioed it in. You should have put her in the ambulance and taken her to the hospital. But you saw something on her wrist, didn't you? Sylvia? Elias signaled the booth again. A zoomed-in photo appeared on the screen. It was a tiny, delicate gold bracelet, clearly sized for an infant. Engraved on the plate was a single name, Sterling. You knew the name, Elias said. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. You looked at that baby, and you didn't see a life to be saved. You saw a lottery ticket. You saw a payout. We saved her, Sylvia screeched. Finding her voice, it was a desperate, clawing sound. The car was on fire. We took her to keep her safe. You took her to hide her, Elias corrected, his voice like a whip. You took her home. You didn't report finding a survivor. You declared the passengers dead or missing, and you drove off with an infant hidden in the back of your ambulance. The screen changed again. This time, it showed a series of grainy photographs of a man in a tuxedo, looking disheveled, standing on a street corner. You tried to reach out, Elias said. You didn't contact me directly because I was in a coma. You contacted my former butler, a man I had fired for theft a month prior. You thought he would be the perfect intermediary for a ransom demand, but the communication broke down. The news reported that I was likely to die from my injuries. You panicked. If I died, there was no one to pay the ransom, and if you returned the baby then, you would be arrested for kidnapping. I listened, horrified. My entire life, the foundation of my identity, was based on a failed business transaction. They hadn't kept me because they loved me. They hadn't even kept me out of pity. They kept me because I was a piece of stolen merchandise that they couldn't fence. So you decided to play the long game, Elias said. You forged a birth certificate. You moved to a different county. You created a new narrative. The orphan, the charity case. We raised her, Richard shouted, pounding his fist on the podium. We fed her. We clothed her. That counts for something. Oh, you got paid for that, Richard, Elias said, a dark smile playing on his lips. You got paid very well. That is the part that disgusts me the most. You see, you didn't just steal my daughter. You stole her inheritance. The screen flickered, and a new document appeared. This one was a bank statement, but it wasn't from the Harland family accounts. It was from a trust fund, the Grace Sterling Trust. My lawyers had set up a trust for my unborn child, Elias explained. It was an irrevocable trust, designed to trigger automatic payments for care and maintenance in the event of my death or incapacitation. It was a blind system, meant to ensure my child was never destitute. He pointed at the screen. Somehow, through your connections in the hospital administration, or perhaps through that crooked lawyer of yours, you found out about the trust. You found out that if you could prove you were the legal guardians of a child with special needs, who was a ward of the state, you could tap into similar state funds or even route the insurance payouts if you manipulated the paperwork enough. But you went further. You found a loophole. The document on the screen highlighted a monthly recurring transfer. Transfer amount, $5,000. Recipient, Sylvia Harland. Memo, special needs caregiver, stipend/disability support. $5,000 a month. Elias read aloud. Starting in February 1997, you falsified medical records. You claimed Grace had severe cognitive delays and required round-the-clock home care. You claimed she was unfit for public schooling, which allowed you to collect homeschooling stipends for years before you finally sent her to public school, pocketing the difference. I stared at the screen. $5,000 a month. In the 1990s, $5,000 was a fortune. It was more money than most families made in 3 months. You collected this money every single month for 18 years, Elias said, the numbers rolling off his tongue like an indictment. And even after she turned 18, you continued to collect under a fraudulent adult-dependent clause until she moved out and filed her own taxes. Breaking the chain, he turned to the audience, his face grim. Let us do the math. $5,000 a month, 12 months a year, 18 years. That is over $1 million in direct payments. But that is not all. There were lump sum withdrawals for emergency medical procedures that never happened. There were withdrawals for specialized equipment that was never bought. The final number appeared on the screen. Bold and black. Total embezzled funds. $1,950,000. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Nearly $2 million. They had stolen nearly $2 million in my name. My knees gave out. I sat back down on the wooden stool, not because I was weak, but because the weight of the truth was too heavy to stand under. All those years, I remembered the winter when I was 10. My coat had a broken zipper. I walked to school holding it closed with one hand, shivering so hard my teeth chattered. I asked Sylvia for a new coat. She told me they couldn't afford it. She told me to be grateful I had a coat at all. That same month, she had collected $5,000 meant for my care. She could have bought me 1,000 coats. I remembered the time I wanted to go on a field trip to the Science Museum. It cost $20. Richard told me money didn't grow on trees. He gave me a lecture on fiscal responsibility that lasted an hour. That month, he had pocketed $5,000. I looked at my clothes, the dress I had bought with my own money. I looked at my hands, calloused from years of drafting and building models. I thought about the $2,000 I sent them every month. I wasn't a burden. I was their employer. I was the golden goose. I was the factory that produced their lifestyle. Every piece of furniture in their house, every meal they ate, every vacation they took, it was all paid for by the ghost of the girl they claimed to have saved. I was a business, I whispered, the realization tasting like ash in my mouth. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't even a pet. I was a business. You were their cash cow, Elias confirmed gently, though his eyes remained fixed on Richard. And when the trust fund payments stopped because you became an independent adult, they panicked. They lost their income stream. That is why they came after you tonight. They didn't just want your savings. They wanted to reactivate the revenue stream. Sylvia suddenly lunged toward the edge of the stage. Her face was twisted into a mask of frantic denial. She looked like a cornered animal lashing out. "It was payment for services," she screamed, spit flying from her mouth. "We earned that money. Do you know how hard it is to raise a child that isn't yours? To look at her every day and know she doesn't belong? We deserved that money. We kept her alive. We could have left her in the snow." "You call that care?" Elias roared, his composure finally cracking. The sound of his voice was terrifying, a raw explosion of paternal rage that made Richard flinch. "I have seen the photos of her growing up," Elias shouted, pointing at me. "I have seen the clothes she wore in her school pictures while her sister wore designer brands. I have seen the medical records of untreated cavities because you were too cheap to take her to a dentist. You collected $5,000 a month and you let her teeth rot?" "She was difficult," Sylvia shrieked. "She was a difficult child. She was a child." Elias yelled back. "She was an innocent child." He took a breath, composing himself, adjusting his cuffs with a sharp, jerky movement. "You claim you cared for her," Elias said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You claim you were loving parents who just needed financial support. You claim the neglect is a fabrication." He looked toward the curtain on the side of the stage. "Well, Richard, Sylvia, I anticipated you might lie. Liars always lie until the handcuffs click, so I brought someone who can clear up the discrepancy." He gestured to the side of the stage. "I have a witness." Sylvia's eyes darted to the curtain. "Who? We don't know anyone. Everyone loves us. The neighbors love us." "Do they?" Elias asked. "Or do they just fear you? Or perhaps they just didn't know enough to speak up. Until now. From behind the velvet curtain, a figure emerged. It wasn't a police officer. It wasn't a lawyer. It was an old woman, leaning heavily on a cane, her steps slow and painful. She wore a simple floral dress and a cardigan that had seen better days. I squinted. I knew that walk. I knew that cardigan. It was Mrs. Roberta. She was the neighbor who lived 3 houses down from us when I was growing up, the one who used to give me cookies when I was playing outside alone, the one the Harlans told me was crazy and senile and forbade me from talking to. They told me she had moved to Florida 5 years ago. Mrs. Roberta walked into the light. She stopped next to Elias. She looked small and frail, but her eyes were sharp, burning with the fierce clarity of someone who has held a secret for too long. She looked at Sylvia. She didn't flinch. "Hello, Sylvia," Mrs. Roberta said into the microphone Elias offered her. Her voice was raspy but steady. "You told everyone I was dead, but I am still here, and I remember everything." Sylvia turned white. White as the snow she had stolen me from. Mrs. Roberta gripped the microphone with a hand that looked like parchment paper wrapped over fragile bird bones. But when she spoke, her voice cut through the emerald room with the clarity of a church bell tolling for a funeral. "They told everyone I had moved to a nursing home in Florida," she said. Her eyes locked on Sylvia. "They told the neighborhood I had lost my mind, but I didn't go anywhere. Sylvia, I just learned to stay inside and watch, and I saw everything." Sylvia was shaking her head frantically, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "She is senile. She doesn't know what she is talking about. Listen to me. She is confused." "I am not confused about the winter of 2001. Mrs. Roberta continued, her voice gaining strength. "It was January. A blizzard had shut down the schools. I looked out my kitchen window, and I saw Grace. She was 5 years old." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had a vague, nightmare-like memory of that day. The biting cold, the feeling of my tears freezing on my cheeks. She was standing on the back porch, Mrs. Roberta told the room. She was wearing nothing but a thin cotton nightgown, no shoes, no coat. She was banging on the glass door, begging to be let in. Her lips were blue. I called the house. I called 3 times. Sylvia finally picked up, when I told her that her daughter was freezing to death on the porch. Do you know what she said? The room was deathly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to have paused. "She laughed," Mrs. Roberta said, pointing a trembling finger at my mother. She said, "Let her freeze a little. It builds character. Besides, if she gets sick, the doctor bills just help our case with the state." "That is what you said. Sylvia, you wanted her sick. You needed her sick so you could keep claiming she was frail." "Liar!" Sylvia shrieked. "You are a liar." "And I heard you." Mrs. Roberta went on, ignoring the outburst. "The walls of our houses were thin. In the summers, when the windows were open, I heard you and Richard in the kitchen. I heard you talking about the golden goose. That is what you called her. You said, 'We have to keep the golden goose alive until she is 18, or the checks stop.' You weren't raising a child. You were farming a paycheck." The revelation hit the audience like a physical blow. The colleagues who had looked at me with suspicion an hour ago were now looking at my parents with unmasked horror, but the real jury, the one that truly mattered to my sister, was happening in the palm of her hand. I looked at Tiffany. She was staring at her phone screen, but the smug satisfaction was gone. Her face was pale, illuminated by the harsh white light of the display. Her thumb was scrolling frantically. "The comments," Tiffany whispered, her voice cracking. "They are changing." Elias took a step toward her. "Read them, Tiffany. Read them out loud like you did before." Tiffany shook her head, clutching the phone to her chest. No, I can't." "Read them," Elias commanded, his voice booming. Tiffany flinched. She looked at the screen, her eyes darting back and forth as if she were reading her own obituary. "User Justice for Grace says, 'I hope these people rot in hell. This is child abuse. User Lawyer Up says, I am recording this stream, sending it to the Chicago PD. This is evidence. User Tiffany is Trash says, you stood there and laughed while your parents destroyed her? Unfollowed. Reported. The viewer count, Elias asked. How high is it? 50,000? Tiffany stammered. It went viral, but not for me. They are hate-watching. They are all hate-watching. Panic seized her. She reached for the end stream button. I have to turn it off. I have to delete it. Don't you touch that screen, Elias said. He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was unmistakable. You wanted an audience, Tiffany. You wanted to be a star. Well, congratulations. You are the star of the biggest scandal in Chicago. Keep it rolling. Let them see the finale. Tiffany began to sob, terrified, ugly tears that smeared her heavy makeup. I didn't know. I didn't know about the trust fund. I thought we were just mean to her. I didn't know it was a crime. Elias laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You didn't know, really? He signaled to his assistant in the booth. A new image popped up on the screen. It was a photograph of a diary page. A different diary. This one was pink, with a lock that had been broken. This is your diary, Tiffany, Elias said. We found it in the trash outside your house 2 days ago. My investigators are very thorough. He pointed to an entry dated 2 years ago. Mom and Dad are freaking out because Grace is moving out soon. I heard them talking about the Sterling money. I can't believe Grace is actually rich. It is so unfair. Why does she get a trust fund and I get nothing? Mom said not to worry, that they will find a way to get it from her. I hope they do. I need a new car. I stared at my sister. The betrayal twisted in my gut like a knife. She hadn't just been a bystander. She hadn't just been a spoiled brat. She had been an accomplice. You knew, I whispered. For 2 years. You knew I was kidnapped. You knew I had a father out there, and you said nothing because you wanted a car? Tiffany looked at me, her face streaked with mascara. I needed it. Grace, you have everything. You are smart. You have a career. I have nothing. I just wanted my fair share. Your fair share of my life? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. Richard, seeing his entire world crumbling, the money, the reputation, the loyalty of his own daughter, finally snapped. The veneer of the respectable suburban father dissolved, revealing the cornered rat beneath. You ruined everything, Richard roared. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Elias. You arrogant bastard. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy my family? He lunged. It was a desperate, clumsy attack. Richard grabbed a heavy glass water pitcher from the podium and charged at Elias. Dad, no, I screamed. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't even move. Before Richard could get within 3 feet of him, 2 shapes blurred into motion from the shadows. The security guards, Elias's security guards, intercepted him. One of them caught Richard's wrist mid-swing, twisting it behind his back with a sickening pop. The pitcher fell to the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamonds. Richard was slammed face first onto the stage floor. Get off me! Do you know who I am? Yes, a voice called out from the audience. We know exactly who you are, Mr. Harland. A woman stood up from the table where my colleagues were sitting. It was Mrs. Gable, the severe, no-nonsense head of human resources at Vanguard Horizons. She adjusted her glasses and walked to the foot of the stage. Mr. Harland, she said, her voice projecting clearly, you are currently employed as a temporary weekend security guard at our North Loop branch, a position you secured, I might add, by constantly mentioning your relation to our rising star, Grace Lockridge. My jaw dropped. I didn't know he worked there. He had told me he was consulting. Consider your contract terminated effective immediately, Mrs. Gable stated. Vanguard Horizons has 0 tolerance for criminal behavior. And Richard? He looked up at her from the floor, his cheek pressed against the carpet. You are banned from all Vanguard properties. If you step foot near our offices again, we will press charges for trespassing." She turned to me, and her expression softened. "Grace, on behalf of the firm, I am mortified. We had no idea. Please know that your partnership track is not only secure, but we will be reviewing your compensation package to ensure it reflects the distinct value you bring to us and the hardship you have endured." "Thank you," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. Elias stepped forward, looking down at Richard, who was pinned to the floor, and Sylvia, who was weeping into her hands. "Here is how this ends," Elias said. His voice was the final gavel. "Option 1, he said, holding up one finger. "I hand over the police report, the bank statements, the witness testimony, and the live stream footage to the district attorney. You will be charged with kidnapping, fraud, embezzlement, extortion, and child endangerment. Given the amount of money involved, it is a federal crime. You will go to prison for 20 years. Minimum," Sylvia wailed louder. Tiffany dropped to her knees. "Option 2, Elias said. "You sign a confession. You admit to everything. You waive all rights to contact Grace ever again, and you liquidate everything." He looked around the room. The house, the cars, the jewelry, Tiffany's designer wardrobe, everything you bought with my daughter's money. You sell it all. Every penny goes back to Grace. It won't cover the $2 million you stole, but it will leave you exactly where you deserve to be, destitute. "You can't take our house," Sylvia cried. "We are old. Where will we go?" "I hear the winters are cold," Elias said coldly. "Maybe it will build character." He looked at them. "So? Prison or poverty? Choose." The alliance of the Harland family, built on greed and lies, disintegrated in an instant. "It was her!" Richard screamed from the floor, pointing his free hand at Sylvia. "It was her idea. She told me the baby was a gold mine. She made me drive the ambulance away. I wanted to call it in. She threatened to leave me if I didn't do it." "You coward!" Sylvia shrieked, jumping up and rushing at him, kicking at his legs while the guard held him down. "You were the one who gambled away our savings. You were the one who needed the money to pay your bookies. You begged me to find a way to get cash. You used that poor girl to cover your debts." "Stop it!" Tiffany yelled, throwing her phone at them. It hit Richard in the shoulder. "You are both monsters. You ruined my life. I could have been a Sterling. I could have been rich legally if you hadn't stolen her. I hate you. I hate both of you." They were tearing each other apart. The mask of the perfect, pious family had fallen off, revealing a nest of vipers biting their own tails. I stood there, watching the chaos. I saw Richard blaming his wife. I saw Sylvia attacking her husband. I saw Tiffany mourning her lost imaginary fortune. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt light. I felt the heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt lift off my shoulders. I wasn't the bad daughter. I wasn't the burden. I wasn't the reason they were unhappy or broke. I was the victim of a 30-year con. I looked at Elias. He was watching me. Not them. He was waiting to see if I was okay. I nodded at him. A small, tentative smile broke through the tears on my face. The invisible chains, the obligation, the shame, the desperate need for their approval, snapped. They didn't break with a bang. They broke with the quiet, satisfying sound of a pen tearing through a fraudulent contract. I was free. The chaos on the stage was a storm of screaming accusations and shattered glass. But as I watched my former family tear each other apart, a strange, icy calm settled over me. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a building has collapsed, when the dust settles and you can finally see the sky again. I looked at Elias, who was standing like a sentinel, his security guards holding Richard down. Elias looked ready to issue another command, to finish them off, but I stepped forward. I reached out and touched his arm. "No," I said softly. "This part is mine." Elias looked down at me. He saw something in my face, perhaps the steel that I had inherited from him. The resilience that had kept me alive in that house of wolves for 30 years. He nodded once, stepped back, and signaled for his guards to pull Richard up to his knees but keep him restrained. I walked over to where the microphone stand had fallen during the scuffle. I picked it up, adjusted the height, and stood center stage. The room, which had been buzzing with the shock of the revelations, fell instantly silent. 80 pairs of eyes fixed on me. They were waiting for tears. They were waiting for a breakdown. They were waiting for the victim to beg for an explanation. I did not cry. I did not beg. I looked at Richard, panting on the floor. I looked at Sylvia, whose mascara was running in black rivers down her pale cheeks. I looked at the audience. "I am not going to sue you," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremor that had plagued me an hour ago. It was the voice I used in boardrooms when I was telling a contractor that their foundation was flawed. A collective exhale went through the Harlans. I saw Richard's shoulders slump in relief. I saw a spark of hope ignite in Sylvia's eyes. They thought I was weak. They thought the years of conditioning, the years of seeking their approval, had made me incapable of pulling the trigger. They thought that deep down, I was still the little girl desperate for a mommy and daddy. "Thank God," Sylvia breathed, clasping her hands together in a prayer gesture. "Oh, Grace, thank God. We knew you had a heart. We knew you wouldn't destroy your own family." "You didn't let me finish," I cut in, my tone sharpening into a blade. "I am not going to sue you because lawsuits are messy. They take years. They require depositions and hearings and lawyer fees. And quite frankly, I do not want to spend another minute of my life thinking about you." I took a step closer to them, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "However," I continued, "Richard was right about one thing tonight. He said this was a night for settling debts. He said he wanted to be paid for his investment. I think that is a brilliant idea." I reached into my clutch, the expensive designer bag they had mocked me for buying, and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times, projecting a new image onto the massive screen behind me, overriding their files. It was not a spreadsheet. It was a series of bank transfer receipts. "For the last 7 years," I said, addressing the room but looking directly at Richard, "I have transferred exactly $2,000 to your joint account on the 1st of every month. I also paid for the new roof in 2019. That was $12,000. I paid for the HVAC replacement in 2021. That was $8,000. I paid for Tiffany's tuition at that beauty school she dropped out of after 3 weeks. That was $5,000. I swiped the screen, scrolling through the evidence of my own exploitation. "I kept records," I said coldly, not because I planned to ask for it back, but because as an accountant for my own life, I needed to know where my money was going. I have the receipts for every flight I booked for you, every medical bill I covered, every grocery run I made. I turned to look at the total sum displayed at the bottom of the screen. $342,000. I read aloud. "That is the principal amount. I am not even charging interest, unlike you." Richard looked at the number, his eyes bulging. "Grace, we spent that. It is gone. We don't have that kind of cash." "I know you don't," I said, "but you have assets. You have a pension. Richard, you have the equity in the house. What is left of it? And Sylvia, you have that jewelry collection you bought with my trust fund money." "You can't ask for that back," Sylvia cried. "Those were gifts. You gave that money freely." "I gave it under duress," I corrected her. "I gave it because you manipulated me into believing you were destitute while you were sitting on a pile of stolen cash. That is called fraud." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice so it sounded less like a speech and more like a threat. "So here's the deal. You are going to transfer every single liquid asset you have to me, tonight, right now. You are going to sign over the title to your cars. You are going to empty your savings. If you do that, I won't sue you in civil court for the $300,000. "We won't do it," Richard spat, trying to muster some of his old bravado. "You are bluffing. You won't drag this through court. You just said you didn't want the hassle." I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "You are right. I won't sue." But if you don't pay me back what I gave you, I will send a very interesting email to the Internal Revenue Service." Richard froze. His face went from red to a terrifying shade of gray. "I did your taxes for 10 years, remember?" I said pleasantly. "I know about the offshore account where you hid the gambling winnings. I know about the consulting business you set up to write off your vacations as business expenses. And most importantly, I know you never declared the income from the Sterling Trust. That is nearly $2 million of unreported income. Richard, the IRS doesn't care about kidnapping, but they care very, very much about tax evasion." I checked my watch. "It is Friday night. If I hit send now, the audit notice will be on your doorstep by Monday morning, and unlike me, the federal government doesn't settle. They seize—" Richard looked at Sylvia. Sylvia looked at Richard. They knew I had them. They knew I held the nuclear codes to their financial existence. "Okay," Richard whispered, his voice broken. "Okay, we will pay. We will give you everything." "Good," I said. "My lawyer will be in touch tomorrow to collect." I turned away from them, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than a bad line item on a budget sheet. My eyes landed on Tiffany. She was still on her knees, clutching her phone, tears streaming down her face. But even in her misery, I saw her glancing at the screen, checking if the viewer count was still holding steady. She was addicted to the attention, even if it was destroying her. I walked over to her. The camera was still streaming. "Stand up, Tiffany," I commanded. She looked up at me, lip trembling. "Grace, please. I am sorry. I will give you the car keys. Just make them stop. The comments are saying I should die." "I don't want you to die," I said, crouching down so my face was level with hers and level with the camera lens. "I want you to learn what it means to actually work for a living." I looked directly into the lens of the smartphone. "Hello, everyone," I said to the 50,000 strangers watching us. "You all know Tiffany as the rich kid influencer. You know her as the girl who unboxes Chanel bags and laughs at people who work 9-to-5 jobs." I pulled my own phone back out. "But I think you should meet the real Tiffany." I opened my messaging app and pulled up a thread from 3 months ago. I held it up to Tiffany's camera so the focus could lock onto the text. "Read it," I told Tiffany. "I can't," she sobbed. "Read it," I snapped. She sniffled, looking at the screen. "It says, 'Just post the link for the donation fund. These morons will buy anything if I cry a little. I need $5,000 for that trip to Tulum.' They are so stupid. They actually think I care about them." The chat exploded. The stream of comments moved so fast it became a blur of color. "Unsubscribe, fake, scammer, I want my money back." "And this one," I said, scrolling to another screenshot. "This is from when you crashed my car. You texted your friend. 'My loser sister is going to pay for it. She's such a doormat. I can wrap her around my finger. She exists to serve me.'" I stood up, towering over her. "You built a brand on being better than everyone else. Tiffany, you built a following by mocking the people who supported you. Well, consider this your cancellation party." "No!" Tiffany screamed, scrambling to grab her phone. "Stop. You are ruining me. This is my career." "This isn't a career," I said, my voice ringing through the hall. "It is a lie. It is a grift. And it is over." As if on cue, Tiffany's phone began to ring. It wasn't a normal ringtone. It was the specific chime she had set for her agency manager. She answered it on speaker, her hands shaking so hard she nearly dropped the device. "Tiffany?" A woman's voice barked through the speaker. "Are you seeing this? We are getting calls from Glow Up Cosmetics, Fast Fashion, and the tea company. They are all pulling their contracts. You are radioactive. We are dropping you. Don't contact the agency again." Click. Tiffany stared at the phone. The stream ended abruptly as her battery died. Or maybe she finally passed out from the shock. She slumped forward onto the carpet, weeping into the pile of synthetic fibers, stripped of her filters, her followers, and her future. It was done. I had dismantled them. I had taken their money. I had taken their reputation. I had taken their pride. I turned to Elias. He was watching me with a look of profound respect. He didn't step in. He didn't try to take credit. He let me be the architect of my own justice. "I am ready to go," I said to him. "One moment," Elias said. He looked at the Harlans, who were a heap of misery on the floor. "Grace said she wouldn't sue you," Elias announced, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "And she is a woman of her word. She won't sue you for the money." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with impending doom. "But I never said I wouldn't press charges," Elias said. Richard's head snapped up. "What? No, she made a deal. We gave up the assets." "She made a deal regarding her civil claims," Elias explained calmly. "But the crime you committed 30 years ago, the fraud involving the Sterling Trust, that is not a civil matter. Richard, that is federal." He gestured toward the double doors at the back of the room. "And while Grace was kind enough to give you a chance to settle your debts with her, the FBI is rarely so lenient." The doors burst open. It wasn't hotel security this time. It was a team of officers in tactical vests, followed by men in suits with federal badges hanging from their necks. They moved with the swift, overwhelming efficiency of a storm making landfall. "Richard Harland, Sylvia Harland, Tiffany Harland," an agent shouted. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and kidnapping. Get on the ground. Now!" The room erupted into chaos. My colleagues jumped out of their chairs. The neighbors gasped, but I didn't watch. I turned my back on them. I heard Richard screaming that it was a mistake. I heard Sylvia wailing my name, begging me to tell them it was a misunderstanding. I heard Tiffany shrieking as they pulled her arms behind her back. I heard the metallic click, click, click of handcuffs tightening around the wrists of the people who had held me captive for 3 decades. I felt Elias's hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the side exit, away from the madness. "Don't look back, Grace," he said softly. "I am not," I replied, and I meant it. I walked toward the exit door, my head high, my steps firm. I was leaving the Emerald Room not as the unwanted daughter, not as the victim, and not as the fraud. I was walking out as Grace, just Grace. And for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The sound of their ruin faded behind me, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and strong, beating out a rhythm of absolute, terrifying freedom. It has been exactly 7 days since the lights went out in the Emerald Room. 1 week, 168 hours. In the grand scheme of a lifetime, that is a blink of an eye. But for me, it feels like I have crossed a bridge between 2 entirely different dimensions. I am sitting in my new office at Vanguard Horizons. It is not the cramped cubicle I occupied for years, nor is it the shared workspace of a junior associate. It is a corner suite on the 45th floor, with floor-to-ceiling glass that offers a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. The morning sun is hitting the water, turning it into a sheet of hammered gold. On the desk in front of me sits a heavy crystal nameplate. It arrived this morning, a gift from the senior partners. It reads, "Grace, Senior Partner." I run my finger over the etched glass. It feels cool and solid. For the first time in my life, my success does not feel like something I have to hide or apologize for. It does not feel like a target for my family's envy. It feels like mine. The silence here is different from the silence in the Harland house. That silence was heavy, loaded with unsaid criticisms and pending explosions. This silence is peaceful. It is the quiet of a sanctuary. My phone buzzes, but I do not flinch. I am no longer afraid of who might be calling. The news about the Harlands has been dominating the local cycle, though the initial frenzy is starting to fade, replaced by the grim reality of the justice system. Richard and Sylvia are currently being held at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Their bail was denied. It turns out that when the FBI dug into their finances, they found evidence that Richard had been trying to move the remaining stolen trust fund money into a cryptocurrency account in the Cayman Islands. That made him a flight risk. They are in separate cells now. I heard from the district attorney that they have turned on each other completely. Richard is trying to cut a deal by claiming Sylvia drugged him into compliance 30 years ago. Sylvia is claiming Richard was abusive and forced her to kidnap me. Their marriage, which I once thought was an impenetrable wall of united cruelty, has crumbled into a pathetic dust of self-preservation. And Tiffany, my sister, or rather, the girl I grew up with, has had the hardest fall because she fell from a height she had built entirely out of clouds. The internet, which she worshipped as a god, turned out to be a vengeful deity. Her accounts have been banned. Her brand deals have evaporated. The bank repossessed her leased SUV 3 days ago. I saw a video yesterday on social media. It wasn't posted by her. It was posted by a teenager in a fast food diner on the outskirts of the city. The video showed Tiffany wearing a hairnet and a grease-stained apron, wiping down a table while a manager yelled at her for moving too slow. She looked tired. She looked stripped of her glamour. She looked, for the first time in her life, like a person who had to understand the value of $1. I didn't feel happy watching it. I didn't feel a surge of vindictive joy. I just felt a quiet sense of balance. The universe has a way of correcting its accounting errors. And Tiffany was finally balancing her ledger. I close my laptop and stand up. I have a meeting, but not with a client. I take the elevator down and walk 2 blocks to Millennium Park. The city is alive with the energy of summer. Tourists are taking photos of the bean. Children are splashing in the Crown Fountain. I walk past them to a quieter bench near the Lurie Garden, where the tall grasses block out the noise of the traffic. Elias is waiting for me. He is not wearing the intimidating black suit he wore at the party. He is wearing a soft gray sweater and canvas trousers. He looks less like a titan of industry and more like a man who is simply enjoying the afternoon sun. When he sees me, his face lights up. It is a genuine, unforced expression that still catches me off guard. "Grace," he says, standing up to greet me. He doesn't hug me immediately. He respects my space. He waits for me to initiate it. I step forward and hug him. It is brief, but it is real. "Hello, Elias." We sit on the bench. We do not force the titles. I do not call him dad yet. He does not call me daughter every 5 seconds. We are 2 adults navigating a minefield of lost time, trying to find a path to each other without setting off any tripwires. "How are you holding up?" he asks. The press can be relentless. "I am managing," I say, watching a bumblebee navigate a purple coneflower. The firm hired a PR crisis team to handle the media. They are spinning it as a story of resilience. The architect who designed her own freedom. It is a bit cheesy, but it keeps the reporters away from my apartment. Elias chuckles. "Resilience, that is an understatement. You have iron in your spine. Grace, I saw that the moment you stood up to Richard." He reaches into a leather satchel he brought with him. "I brought you something. I wasn't sure if you were ready to see them, so if you want me to put them away, just say the word." He pulls out a thick, leather-bound photo album. It looks old. The leather is worn at the corners. I take a deep breath. "I am ready." He opens the album. The first page is a photograph of a woman laughing. She is sitting on a sailboat, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. She is looking at the camera with eyes that are identical to mine. Gray, piercing, full of life. "This is Elena," Elias says softly. "Your mother." I trace the face in the photo. It is like looking into a mirror that shows me a version of myself I never got to be. A version that was carefree, loved, and safe. She was an artist, Elias tells me. She painted landscapes. She was fierce, too. She once threw a glass of wine at a senator because he insulted her charity work. "You have her temper, I think, and her hands." He turns the page. There are photos of her holding a baby, holding me. She is looking at the infant in her arms with an expression of such absolute, terrifying love that my chest aches. "She loved you more than anything," Elias says, his voice thick. "Before you were even born, she used to sing to you. She painted murals on the walls of your nursery. She didn't see you as a burden, Grace. She saw you as a miracle. I let the tears fall. They are not the angry tears of the party. They are healing tears. They are the tears that wash away the lie Sylvia had planted in my head. The lie that I was unwanted, that I was difficult, that I was a mistake. I was never a mistake. I was a miracle that was stolen. We sit there for a long time, just turning pages. Elias tells me stories about her. He tells me about the day I was born. He tells me about the lullabies she sang. He is giving me back my history, piece by piece, eventually. He closes the book. He looks at me with a serious expression. "There is something else," he says. "I know you are a partner at Vanguard now. I know you have your own career. And I would never ask you to leave it. I respect what you have built." He pauses, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "But I have a project, a personal project. I have been wanting to build it for 20 years. But I never had the heart to start it. It felt wrong to do it without her." He hands me the paper. It is a zoning permit for a plot of land on the south side, in a neighborhood that has been neglected for decades. "I want to build a center," Elias says. "A residential and educational facility for children in the foster system. A place that is not an institution, but a home. A place with art studios, and libraries, and gardens. A place where no child ever feels like a transaction." He looks me in the eye. "I want to hire Vanguard Horizons to design it, and I want you to be the lead architect. I don't want to give you money, Grace. I want to give you a canvas. I want us to build this together." I look at the permit. I imagine the building. I see the light flooding into the atrium. I see the safe corners where a scared kid could read a book. I see the structure of a place that could have saved a version of me. "Yes," I say without hesitation. "I will design it, but I have one condition." Elias smiles, a shadow of the smirk I saw when he confronted Richard. "You are definitely my daughter, always negotiating. What is the condition?" I reach into my purse and pull out a new business card. I had them printed yesterday. I haven't shown them to anyone yet. I hand the card to him. He reads it. Grace Vance, senior partner. He looks up, confused for a second, and then his eyes widen as he realizes the significance. "Vance," he whispers. "Elena's maiden name. I am not a Harland," I say firmly. "I will never be a Harland again, but I'm not ready to be a Sterling yet. Elias, that name comes with too much weight, too much history that I haven't lived. I need to be my own person, but I want to carry her with me. I want to be the daughter of the woman who loved me first." Elias looks at the card, and I see his hand tremble slightly. He nods, blinking rapidly. "Grace Vance, it is a beautiful name. She would have been incredibly proud." "So," I say, tapping the zoning permit, "the Elena Vance Center for Child Advocacy. That is what we are calling it." "Agreed," Elias says. "The Elena Vance Center." We stand up. The sun is beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, warm shadows across the grass. The air is crisp and clean. I look at the man standing beside me. He is a stranger in many ways, but he is also the source of the blood in my veins. We have a lifetime of catching up to do. There will be awkward dinners. There will be disagreements. There will be the slow, difficult work of building trust. But for the first time, I am not building on a foundation of sand. I am building on bedrock. I look at the city skyline, the city I helped shape, the city that watched me struggle and is now watching me rise. I think about the DNA test that started this entire storm. Richard and Sylvia thought that a piece of paper proving I wasn't theirs would destroy me. They thought that by stripping me of their name, they were stripping me of my power. They were so wrong. They wanted to use DNA to erase me, to discard me like a defective product. But they forgot that DNA does not just determine who you belong to, it determines what you are made of. They thought they were crushing a sparrow, but they didn't realize they were trying to cage a storm. I take a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of a future that is finally, irrevocably, mine. I am not the child of a transaction. I am not the daughter of a lie. I am the daughter of a dragon, not a snake. And now, finally, I have my wings. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Please leave a comment below telling me your country or city so we can connect. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and redemption, please subscribe to BitterSweet Drama Stories, like the video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach more people who need to see that the truth always wins.